Hello, greetings, welcome back to Disenthrall. I will be Patrick Smith. This might be a first on the channel. A fourth time returning guest that disagrees with me on some fundamental things, which is, I mean, pretty much the best shows ever is when we find people that know how to disagree and do so respectfully. Let's get into it. He has a plan, she has a plan, and you get to pay for it regardless.
The best way to get someone motivated is to stand for something strongly, deeply, passionately.
Subscribe to Disenthrall. Do as you're told.
Mr. James Freeman, I will be Patrick Smith. I literally say it every time. I don't know how to make it more clear than that, James. Good to see you in the chat. Welcome back to the show, Matt. How are you?
I'm good, Patrick. How you doing?
I'm good. Okay, so brief history, and I'll set this up, and then, well, actually, we should probably introduce you first. Who the hell are you?
My name is Matthew Sands. I'm from England. I represent a project called the Nations of Sanity, which is based on the assertion that crime and therefore also law can and should be defined by the concept of individual self-ownership and established through a peace agreement. And we present a three-part one that we think would work.
Excellent. Okay, so here's the history. Going way back 4 or 5 years ago, maybe was the first time we had you on the show. We had a long discussion. I think it was like 2 hours long. Then I think we may have had a second long discussion that was like 2.5 hours long, maybe on Discord, recorded voice or something. Then we had a third long discussion on live stream in 2019. And every time I think we ended the discussion with some, I specifically did not go back and watch the old ones because I wanted to start fresh. But my memory tells me that I think we left on some, it felt like a failure to communicate. That's what it felt like. It didn't feel like we disagreed. It felt like we just could not communicate clearly. And so I kind of put the entire discussion on pause for years now. It's been 4 years since we spoke. And I think, and when people think I'm wrong on something, I can't just leave it on pause forever. I got to bring you back, and I gotta I got to hear why I'm wrong and figure out if I'm wrong and get back into it. And so that's what we're doing here today. This is sort of I call it a like a round 4 on the YouTube video title, but as always, we're not actually fighting. We're usually having pretty nuanced, gentle conversation, let's say. So, you are proffering a project that's attempting to get libertarian-leaning types to circle the wagons around the non-aggression principle and self-ownership. And I remember, this was the whole rub was when you get to the part where you say, sort of enforce the NAP as law or something to that effect. Do you want to maybe intro that and we can pick it up from there? Or choose your own adventure. We can put all that aside and maybe go to what are rights and who gets them and maybe pick it up from there. I think those might be the 2 good introductory points for the conversation.
I'll go with the law one, if that's all right. Just because that's kind of like the premise of the project is, and kind of if I was to sort of name something that differentiates what I'm representing from sort of other voluntarists or anarchists, that also, because I'm obviously not the only person preaching the non-aggression principle in the world. But I suppose this specific idea of saying that this can and should be established and enforced as a law. This whole project is based on this kind of assertion that crime and, therefore also law, can and should be defined by the concept of individual self-ownership. And the thing about establishing the non-aggression principle as the law, especially if it's done through a peace agreement, so it's like the terms of peace, rather than the dictates of a ruling authority, which would obviously contradict the principle itself. The idea of the non-aggression principle as law is, from my point of view, it's the only standard of law that we could justifiably enforce, because enforcing it would just be, by definition, defensive. It would just be protecting people's rights as opposed to violating people's rights. Like currently the law does a bit of both. Some laws obviously protect it, some violate it. The enforcement of all of these laws is obviously funded through a violation of it. But, but this is where the contradiction happens. And I feel like there's not many things that could unite people, even theoretically, because we're all so different. But there seems to be an objective truth that the non-aggression principle represents, and that the concept of individual self-ownership represents, that could, at least theoretically, unite people. I understand the world's more complicated than that in the real world, but there's a certain undeniability from, at least from where I'm looking at it, and that's why I kind of invite scrutiny on this assertion, because from my point of view, there is this kind of objective truth. It's almost like mathematical, like 2 + 2 = 4. I mean, we still have to start with a presupposition, and that might be something that you'll pick apart. Not that I want to predict the conversation, but I suspect that you might pick apart the whole, the fact that I need a presupposition, or the fact that, what I'm using as a presupposition or whatever. I don't want to give your arguments for you, but that's
go ahead. This is actually a good refresher. This is a good refresher for where we left off. So please, maybe, why don't you, if you feel competent to do so, and it's fine if you don't, steelman my objection.
Well, I mean, I think one of your objections was, and might be in this conversation, the problem with my claim of objectivity is that I'm needing a presupposition, which kind of undermines my claim that it's objectively true, because I have to start with a presupposition. I mean, if that was to be your objection, my kind of comeback would be that you always have to have a presupposition. There is that kind of, you can't get an ought from an is truth. You have to have either a presupposition or a hypothetical imperative to kick you off into the ought territory. We can't devise morality from simple facts of nature, but what we can do is say that if we're putting morality on the table, if there is such a thing as rights, then the only coherent way for rights to exist is starting with the presupposition of individual self-ownership. Now, people could reject morality altogether and reject the concept of rights, and I couldn't really argue against them. They could say, well, might is right, there's no such thing as morality, blah, blah, blah. But then if they do that, then they can't obviously invoke morality or rights, later down the line, because obviously that would be a contradiction to where they're standing from. So from my point of view, is like if you had one of those kind of yes/no charts, where you say, you ask a question and yes/no leads you to a certain thing. If you start off rejecting either morality or the concept of individual self-ownership, then it kind of leads you with nowhere to go. Whereas if you start off with those as your presupposition, you can build an internally consistent and universalizable principle, like I say, that I think objectively defines what is and isn't a crime, because it lays down our rights. So it kind of makes it self-evident. Once you have the presupposition of individual self-ownership, what is and isn't a crime becomes objectively identifiable. It doesn't become a matter of opinion because it's self-evident from that presupposition. If I own me, then it's not argumentable whether you get to rob me, rape me, murder me, and all of those things, because we've already established that you don't, by the fact that we have the presupposition that I have right only over myself and you have right over yourself. So that's kind of like my argument in a nutshell.
I mean, I don't disagree with most of it. I disagree with some of the fundamentals on just making an arbitrary presupposition towards self-ownership. I think we can do better. And it's interesting. Well, first of all, I realize I haven't really spoken to you since before COVID. So this is a weird, we just didn't even talk about that. How you been? I see you.
Good. Yeah, I'm survived it.
Yeah. I mean, how is the state of tyranny in where you live?
Well, I mean, like a lot of places, we had lockdowns, and what little pretense of rights that existed went out the window pretty quickly in most places, including I had a big whole dispute with my employer about the fact that they wanted me to wear a mask and wouldn't recognize medical exemptions, and that ended with them having to pay me in full while I was off because they didn't want me in there without a mask. And yeah, I mean, it's it's kind of crazy how it's all gone. I mean, the thing is with this world, whether it's COVID or anything else, the insanity never surprises me. It's like, I wish it did, but it kind of doesn't. I don't know whether that's me jaded and cynical in my old age, but it's just like, yeah, of course. I mean, even before a lot of the evidence, I didn't get jabbed or anything like that, but even before I knew anything about them, just my instinct told me, well, if the government's saying this, I'm pretty sure the truth is in the opposite direction. And sure enough, time has shown that to be true. So.
Well, another thing time has done is that it's made you look better and me worse. So good job on the last 4 years. You're looking great. You're looking healthy. It's good to see you survived the lockdowns.
Thank you, man. I'll give a shout out to the keto diet on that one.
Hey, there you go. The most weight I've ever lost on a diet has been keto. I felt great too. I need to try that again. I just after 3 months of nothing but bacon and steak, I know it sounds heretical to say. I needed a little bit. I needed some bread. Anyway, so
I do have some cheat days now and then. So
yeah. What was I about to say?
Sorry.
Oh, I lost it. Okay, so you specifically wanted to talk about the nation sanity thing, and I remember the objection being not to. I mean, plenty of people think self-ownership is sort of presumable, and build the structure that I agree with all of the conclusions on. It's just like my objection to Rothbard, just like my objection to Hoppe's argumentation ethics. I can't talk right now. I agree with all the conclusions, even with Passio's spook-filled natural law, assertion-filled natural law. I agree with the conclusions. That's why I still, consider myself libertarian, is because we align on, most of the end goals. I think it's important that we refine our understanding of the principles that get us to those goals so that we can be more consistent and universalizable, let's say, as we go throughout life. I'm not sure what's important for this conversation. Why don't you guys let us know in chat? Do you want us to talk more about the fundamentals of what are rights and who gets them, or should we explore his Nations of Sanity project? Because I think I want to keep this conversation moving in a direction that's interesting for everybody. I think the objection I had with Nations of Sanity as a project was that it wasn't to do with enforcing the normal outcomes and conclusions of the non-aggression in terms of dispute resolution. If you murder or rape somebody, then you can't complain when somebody uses force against you. I think, if I remember, it was both the purpose for you making it law, and the problem I had with it was you taking the subjective interpretations on some of the evaluations of the non-aggression principle in gray areas, and then enforcing those conclusions on everyone that didn't necessarily have those same judgments on stuff. Man, it's been 4 years, so it's been a while. Let me know if I got that wrong. The other part of the conversation that we could go down is we could introspect into Matt's definition of self-ownership as the starting point for rights versus the alternatives. So let us know in chat if you have an opinion on that. Matt, do you have an opinion on that?
I'm happy to go in any direction people want. I mean, one thing just regarding the grey area, just to sort of clarify my position on that, because there is obviously an issue with grey areas, and it's nice and easy when it's all black and white, murder, rape, and assault and theft, and that's nice and easy. But there's obviously there's sort of grey areas and fuzzy edges, and my kind of approach to it is that we have to draw a line in the sand and not let the grey area infect the black and white. So I always use, and I'm pretty sure I've given this analogy to you before, but one of the articles I have on my website that uses the analogy of the desert and the grassland, and sort of say that, you have the desert and you have the grassland, and they're nice and distinguishable from each other. But if you were walking from one to the other geographically, you'd have this area in between where one would slowly become the other. What I think Walter Block calls it the continuum problem, where you go from things like, obviously comes up with issues maybe like abortion or age of consent, or, what's the right distance, within someone's personal space and stuff like that. I mean, certainly things with and just to clarify, the approach that I kind of advocate for with the Nations of Sanity project is to basically say that what we need to do is draw a line in the sand that says, okay, we acknowledge that grey areas exist, but we need to draw a line in the sand so that doesn't infect the black and white. So we can say, to use a desert grassland example, we draw a line and say, okay, at this point it's definitely the desert, because there's no characteristics of grassland here, it's desert here. And that would sort of be symbolic of definitely non-aggression principle violations. And if we say the grassland represent, definitely, not a violation of the non-aggression principle, and that in-between area is the grey area. And what I would say is we can't enforce the grey area as a matter of law, but there's still going to be issues where grey area conflicts come up, and there's, we've got a who's right and wrong here kind of thing. And I think that self-ownership still provides an answer in those scenarios, because, and I think of a few examples, but I mean, one of the examples I give is age of consent, which is a difficult one because I understand that age of consent isn't as simple as a number of age. And there's other things like mental competency and what have you that come into play with regards to defining somebody as a total moral agent that's like a competent adult that can consent and stuff, and separating them from a vulnerable child that can't. But if we accept that same kind of principle of sort of like gradients and that, and if we just forget about the mental competency for a moment and just sort of say, well, even if we were arguing about age, there's still not a clear line of when that everyone's going to agree on when people come from child to adult. But what we can do is we can say, okay, well, there's still a minimum and a maximum. There's still a kind of, okay, well, even if it's a grey area between these ages, we can say below this point, we're all going to say, no, this is definitely a child. And above this point, we'll say this is definitely an adult. And in that grey area, we would probably have to say that, okay, if it's genuinely a grey area and we can't sort of give that beyond doubt certainty, then it would be the parents who would have kind of authority to dictate within that grey area. And they would kind of say, okay, I think my child is free from my guardianship now, they're an adult, if it's within this grey area. Or I say, no, I need to hold on to them for a little bit longer, they're not quite ready, you know what I mean? Again, if it's in that grey area, and by having the kind of lines in the sand that separate the grey area from the black and white either side, you're preventing, a child from being, violated in some way by having their, consent fabricated. and you're also preventing an adult from being imprisoned by parents who just want to hold some kind of guardianship authority over them into their adulthood. And if there's a grey area in between, because it's literally a grey area, and like I say, if we take this approach that we can only enforce the black and white we have, it's a little bit like that beyond reasonable doubt approach that's taken with criminal law. You know, like you have to have someone's guilt proven beyond a reasonable doubt, because if you lack that reasonable certainty, then you're acting with reckless criminal recklessness with regards to the force that you might dish out on them as a punishment for the crime that you're accusing them of, which is why you can't just punish somebody for a crime if you've got like flimsy evidence that they even committed it or something like that. So it'll be a similar kind of approach to like, and I kind of liken it to sort of things with like the difference between me and you having a disagreement over the best way to raise your child in areas that might be a grey area. And then when you step over that line of actual child abuse, and I think I'm justified in actually coming in and taking your child from you because you're actually stepping over that black and white line, then I'm saying, okay, I've got that certainty now. But if I did it without that certainty, then I'm potentially guilty of kidnapping your child. You know what I mean? So it's kind of like, so my sort of cut a long story short, and I've gone on a bit there, but basically what I'm saying is the idea is look, we can enforce the non-aggression principles law if we consider that over that line in the sand we've drawn for black and white, and then the grey area, we still have a self-ownership driven guide to how we deal with the grey area as to who would have the kind of whatever the word is, authority over the grey area, or the better right to call the grey area. And in the case of like a child, say like a vaccination, for example, that would be the parent, because they would have the guardianship, which would give them greater right over anybody else to determine that grey area welfare of the child. But like I say, if they're actually outright abusing them, then other people from outside can step in and take it. Does that make sense?
Yes. Okay.
Whether you
so there's three pieces of this in my mind that we might spend time on. The first is someone decides what these standards are. These is this entire thing named line in the sand because your last name is Sands? Is that what this all is?
It's just coincidence.
This is just your ego. Or are we just? No, I'm just kidding.
It's the universe telling you this is meant to be.
I'm sure no one's cracked that joke before. Let's see. So somebody has to decide where the lines in the sand are. That's a question mark. Interesting. How are you going to decide that? Democratically? Jesus Christ. Second part, the second question mark would be the phrase that you said, enforce as law. Now, I know what enforce means, but I don't want to assume what you mean by law. What do you mean by that?
Well, to distinguish it from, like, say, rules, like if you joined a club and there were some rules or conditions to joining that club, that's not law, because that's just rules and they only apply to you if you want to be in my club. And if you break the rules, I can kick you out of my club, but I can't do anything else. Law, what we're saying is like, how we kind of traditionally define law is as in like enforceable by force, like, applies to everybody. It's not something that needs your agreement beforehand. I know I present it as a peace agreement, and obviously I want enough people to agree for that to actually be, worth whatever paper it might be written on. But it's like, you don't need a rapist's permission to enforce laws against rape. You know what I mean? You don't need a thief's permission to enforce laws against theft. But I do need your permission if I've got some special club that's got rules and stuff like that. So that's what I mean by law. I'm just distinguishing it from rules and kind of and law with the dichotomy of crime as well. Because I'm basically saying, look, the non-aggression principle and the concept of individual self-ownership defines crime, objectively speaking. So therefore, it gives us law, objectively speaking. Now, the only way to establish that is through a peace agreement, like as terms of peace, because as I say, we can't do it through any ruling authority, because obviously a ruling authority would be criminal under that very law. So, that's the only way to establish it as law without it kind of contradicting itself. Because you could establish it as terms of peace. Because if me and you, like say, enough of us for it to actually matter, got together and agreed to this peace agreement, so yeah, this is the law of the land, doesn't mean that everybody has to agree to it, but anyone that violates it, whether they are part of the agreement or not, is aggressing. You know what I mean? By I mean, really, what the agreement is really just coming together so that we all know that we understand and agree what is and isn't, objectively speaking, a crime, and what is and isn't the terms of peace between peaceful, civilized people. And anybody who wants to violate that, we're all agreeing that those people are aggressing, and force used against them, providing it's obviously proportionate and necessary in accordance with the crime, is, justified. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to obviously, agree on every little detail, but that's the kind of broad strokes of the kind of agreement. It's basically saying, okay, look, the law isn't what a democratic majority says. The law isn't what a king or queen says. The law, it certainly should be what this principle says it would be, what this concept says it would be. If we start with that presupposition that everybody has right over only themselves, then what we are and aren't allowed to do, and where force is and isn't justified, becomes self-evident. So, like I say, if we lived in a society where this was a reality, I don't see how anyone would have any complaint. I don't see how anyone could point and say, well, you're contradicting yourself here, or, you know what I mean? Because the thing is the only people that could argue against this would be people that reject morality altogether, that reject the concept of individual self-ownership altogether, in which case they can't they've got, if they reject all of that and they commit a crime and we use force against them, then they've got no argument. And then if they accept the concept and they commit a crime, they've also got no argument if we use force against them. It's kind of like, it's like the internal logic of it, the internal consistency of it, and the universalizable nature of it is what makes it kind of objectively undeniable to me. And even though you need the presupposition, which I understand is an issue, the fact of the matter is okay, yeah, but if you reject the presupposition, like I say, if you start on that yes/no chart, if you reject the presupposition at the beginning, then you've got nowhere to go with regards to complaining about any of the force that's used against you to enforce any of these laws. And if you accept the presupposition, you also have nowhere to go with regards to objecting to the force used against you to enforce any of these laws.
I'm glad that we took a break, because I think I've grown in my competency to have these conversations significantly since 4 or 5 years ago. So I'm able to see the moving parts in play clearer. I find when I was listening to you that it seems you are jumping back and forth between sort of a clear, simple case that we would agree on and situations we wouldn't. And when we blur those lines, we pave over the point of disagreement rather than addressing the point of disagreement. And what I mean by that is, okay, so there's some contradictions that seem to be apparent. You say enforce as law. When you defined law, it was a rule that applies to everyone or that can be enforced on everyone. But you also call it a peace agreement, which implies that that the people that are party to the agreement agree to it. So it's more of a contractual agreement. So so you're both saying that you can so it seems that you are saying that two parties can come together and agree on something that can then be enacted on people that weren't part of that agreement. So can you address that?
Yeah. Well, what I'm saying is, I mean, the agreement is really more how I can see this like being actually established. Like, so it's kind of like so that we all know we're on the same page kind of thing. I mean, from a point of view, is like if let's say a super advanced alien race came down to Earth and they saw the Nations of Sanity on YouTube and said, oh, well, we like that. We think that's good. And they come over to me and say, hey, Matt, we've got the technology to basically, put all of the armies surrendered to our will. We can deactivate their nukes and all of that sort of stuff. So we can enforce this for you pretty strongly. So you don't need to get your little peace agreement. It doesn't matter how many people agree to it. We'll just enforce it for you. Again, I still don't think anyone would have any problem. It's not about the people that it's being enforced on agreeing to it. It's more about having enough people to agree to it so that we actually can kind of like do it, so we can actually establish a societal understanding of what law is and should be. And enough of us agree to it that we enforce it on those that either don't agree to it or would violate it regardless of whether they agree to it. It's kind of just to get us all on the same page, because there's too many people that are enforcing laws that obviously violate it. So it's just about that, really. Sorry.
Yeah. So Now, my response would be, okay, well, the people that haven't agreed to it, it would be unlibertarian of you to enforce your agreement on them. And I don't want your response to be to jump back to the stuff that we agree on and say, well, rape and murder and theft, those are clear cases of non-consensual property interaction. So that's not what I'm talking about. The objection is specifically centered on, I guess you would say, gray areas. Now, let me preface this, because going back years and years, I am the guy. I feel like I started this on libertarian thought. Maybe that's hubristic, and I don't intend it to be. I'm just saying I was the first one that just bit every bullet I could find, every edge case, every flagpole scenario, everything, every continuum problem that blocks Spirited into existence. I refused to simply sit on my hands and say, well, it's a continuum problem. I guess, golly shucks, we just going to have to do the best we can to, pick our DROs. I think that's lazy. I think we can do better. I think we can think through things more rigorously to solve some of these continuum problems rather than just say, it's a continuum problem. So I just wanted to put that out there for the people watching that that's who I am. But there are going to be people. Now we're going to move to reality. There are going to be people that disagree with whatever solution that we come up with to continuum problems. And I want to specifically not use age of consent for our talk. I think we can come up with something a little bit less emotionally charged. And I think it could even be something silly just to illustrate the point. So I don't know. Maybe we could even do like property abandonment. Some people think that, well, I think we all agree that we can abandon property if we do it sort of explicitly. Some people think that you can abandon property through neglect after a certain amount of time or, whatever. I don't want this to become a discussion about whether or not those are good rules. I want to just use this as an example of people that disagree, which will create property disputes between two separate nations of sanity, let's say, with two separate peace agreements. Now, if you are suggesting that this agreement on the solutions to these gray areas, let's say, maybe I picked a bad one because anyway, I probably picked a bad one, and feel free to suggest a better one. But if we're only enforcing the law that is these property ownership rules, including property abandonment by not being there for, let's say, 5 years, I don't know, there's our line in the sand. That's the line in the sand that, whoever chose for this peace agreement. If they only enforce those property rules on the people that agreed and signed on to that agreement, then there's no issue. It doesn't seem to be what you're suggesting. It seems to be you're suggesting that once you have this agreement between some portion of people, that agreement can then be enforced on people that weren't party to it. And that is the entire rub that I think we've ever had. So maybe you could speak to that.
Yeah, well, I mean, to clarify, the whole idea with this agreement is that we're saying that the non-aggression principle, that the black and white can be enforced as law. So we're not stating within that agreement that we can enforce what we would call grey areas. So what we're saying is, and I do agree with you that I think a lot of these grey areas can either be eliminated or the scope of them can certainly be reduced a lot, because I think there is an answer if we just aren't so lazy with a lot of these subjects, you know what I mean, and actually dive into them. I think we can find an objectively identifiable answer. But even in situations where there's sort of genuine grey area, and I know you didn't like the age of consent. The only reason I used that, it doesn't have to be age of consent, but was just like, it was a nice, easy one to sort of present the example where you've got grey areas of, doesn't even have to be age of consent, but anything to do with raising your children, and you think, oh, well, there's a grey area there. And it's like, well, okay, if there's a grey area, you've got an obvious answer of who's in charge of that grey area, as in, because you have a parent who is the guardian, so they would be, So, and I often think that there's, so sorry, just to clarify, the peace agreement isn't about enforcing grey areas, it's about enforcing the black and white. And what we would encourage is that if people want rules that delve into the grey areas so that they're dealing with people that are on the same page as them within those grey areas, then that would be like, that would be rules then. That wouldn't be laws. That would be rules they're agreeing to within voluntary collectives that only apply to the people within those voluntary collectives. So what I'm saying is I could only enforce a rule within the grey area on you if we're part of the same club and you agree to those standards within that grey area. But as a part of this kind of universal agreement that I'm talking about, then I can only enforce black and white standards where I've got that kind of beyond reasonable doubt certainty, because then I'm dealing with law. It's almost a little bit the difference, although it's not exactly the same, but it's a little bit similar to the difference between criminal law and civil law, where for criminal law you have to have that kind of standard of certainty because, to prosecute somebody criminally, whereas for a lot of civil cases they deal with preponderance of evidence, and it's not exactly the same because it's still imposed on people and stuff like that. But imagine civil law was only applied to people that you had contractual agreements. Say you were part of some kind of homeowners agreement or something like that, or some kind of neighborhood thing or a club or anything that's got its own little rules where you agree to be on the same page as each other within these grey areas because you want a bit more definition with regards to things, that's a bit more defined than just this black and white universal agreement. I just think that we still need this universal black and white agreement sort of to cover everybody, because otherwise criminals will run amok and they'll, and the thing is what is and isn't a crime, and what in a true sense, what I think is a true sense as objectively definable by this concept, gets lost under what has become law. Like I think that's the thing why I focus on. I mean, because sometimes I trigger anarchists by even saying law, and sometimes I think maybe I shouldn't say law. I should just say terms of peace. And
you might be doing it on purpose.
Well, maybe. But also the thing about it is I'm like, well, law doesn't have to be the dictates of a ruling authority, which is what it currently is. Law can be, what we enforce as like the terms of peace, because it's the same thing. It's what we're enforcing it in the same way. We're using force. We're saying if you do this, we'll use force against you, and it doesn't matter if we've got agreements or whatever. But like I say, that's why, just to clarify that, I'm not talking about enforcing grey areas on people through this agreement that aren't part of any agreement. I'm talking about enforcing only the black and white of the non-aggression principle. And then, the only thing that this universal agreement does with regards to the grey area is dictate the approach that we take to it, where we have to say, well, if you agree that it's a grey area, then by that admission, you're saying you can't enforce it because you're admitting that you have reasonable doubt over whether this person's even guilty of the crime you're going to punish them for. So by your own admission, by your own standard that you've kind of declared, you lack the reasonable certain, which would make any force you use against them criminally reckless. It's like you see someone walking near your house and you've heard that your house just got burgled. You immediately open fire on someone. You don't have enough evidence that they're the one who burgled your house. They could just be someone who's walking past your house. So you're criminally reckless in the force you use. Whereas if the person, if, say, for example, you saw them running, or they came into your house and smashed into your house, and you don't have any, you've got the reasonable certainty and all the rest of it, then your force is obviously justified. So it's kind of just taking that approach. So sorry, I just wanted to just clarify that I do agree with you that you shouldn't enforce grey areas to people that haven't agreed to those grey areas, but we can enforce the black and white. So that's what the peace agreement is.
Okay, so I think we're doing better than we've ever done before, and that says a lot considering how many hours we've spoken. I swear to God, though, that this is a change from where we used to discuss this stuff in terms of you only enforcing the black and white areas. I'm pretty sure we've spent hours a long time ago disagreeing not about enforcing the black and white stuff, but about enforcing the interpretations of the gray areas on people that didn't agree to the peace treaty, let's say. I really, really think that's a change. And why do I think that's a change? Is because I don't have an objection when you get rid of my only objection. So that's why I think it was a change. Do you remember it differently?
We misunderstood each other. I mean, from my point of view, I haven't changed, but maybe we understood each other a little differently, because from my memory, it wasn't that specifically, but it was more that you were picking apart how can I draw the line? Oh, I can do that too. I'm on this continuum. Yeah, I think it was more on that. I mean, I certainly never advocated like the whole point of it is to draw the line. The reason why we're drawing the line in the sand is so we can say that everything on this side of the line we can enforce as law, and everything that's not on that side we can't. So that's a central part of it. So I definitely wouldn't have ever advocated, but I think you did pick apart the fact that, okay, well, even if we accept that, drawing the line, how are you doing that, Mr. Smarty Pants? I think that was, at least that was my perception of your objection anyway.
Yeah, so the next thing I was going to say was that there's almost no such thing as black and white. Like, everything is interpretable differently by different people. So I'm even trying to just imagine in my mind, like, how could you craft a peace agreement that only handled the black and white stuff? Because, I mean, like, the example I gave was abandonment. Like you can't even say just taking property from somebody without their consent is theft in that scenario, because some commie ass motherfucker is going to come along and be like, well, you abandon it, and I consider abandoned property unhomesteaded, and I rehomesteaded it, and it's mine now, and boom. Okay, so like even something as basic as owning a square foot of land becomes not black and white anymore. And what is black and white then becomes my question to you. What can't I pick apart and turn into a gray area? Because if I can do that with pretty much anything that you're about to say, then I kind of think your project might be hopeless only if you're attempting to do like one thing for everybody. But if we have a decentralized thing where there's a lot of competing DROs and it's all a bunch of little peace agreements between people that consent explicitly to specific sets of rules for this group of people in that area and that, and they're like, if I'm consenting to an explicit set of rules for property that I own, that's the only way this works. And it's a million peace agreements that all competitively cooperate. Cooperation is what they call it in business, right? You have companies that are competing with each other, but they also cooperate when they need to serve their customers better. Example that I always use is the cell phone companies, right? You have a bunch of people, they're competitors, AT&T and Verizon are competitors, but they also hire people to write code to make their servers talk to each other for the purposes of sending text messages from a customer on one company to a customer on the other. That's cooperation. So you'd have the same situation with DROs. You'd have a big decentralized web of interlocking agreements. I think that's realistic. I don't think anything more monolithic than that. I think I can destroy that by, like, let's go back to my challenge to you. Give me a thing that's black and white, and I will show you how it's not.
Okay. Well, just quickly on the DROs, though, because I don't object to those, but I just think that they should operate within the parameters of this larger peace agreement that is more broader stroke with regards to this kind of line in the sand. So you can still have your, like I said, I mean, in fact, I think that probably would be the way to go with what you're advocating for. I just think you need this overall peace agreement that they're all operating with under, and then they can have their own little interpretations that apply to their own little members and stuff like that. That's all fine, but it still needs to be under that kind of larger umbrella of a coherent and even if it's somewhat low resolution understanding of the non-aggression principle and the concept of individual self-ownership. Like we can have all of these little peace agreements, but they all need to be some kind of incarnation of this overarching understanding of the concept of individual self-ownership and the non-aggression principle. And as you said yourself, a lot of these so-called grey areas are black and white when you examine them closely, like the property abandonment thing. I think that's quite simple. You got people can say, all right, there's obviously explicitly abandoning my property. There's no argument there. But then people say, well, what about when they implicitly, they've left it for 5 years, 10 years or whatever? Well, the thing is with some kind of implicit consent is that can't override explicit consent. So if the property owner says after 10 years or 50 years or whatever, if he's still alive and well and says, oh, actually, no, he sees commies moving in and says, no, excuse me, that's my property. I'm using that. And they're like, well, you haven't used it for 10 years. It's implied that you'd abandon it. It's like, well, okay, I can explicitly tell you that implicit assumption you made is incorrect. It's a little bit like I always say about how, like, I think someone gave up the example of like, oh, are you assaulting somebody if you push them out of the way of an oncoming bus? And I say no, because you're operating with implicit consent that they want you to push them out of the way but they just don't have time to give it to you. But let's say, for example, you were happening to walk onto a movie set and it's all part of some kind of stunt, and he explicitly says, don't push me out the way out of the bus because this is something I'm doing, and you still do it, then, you know what I mean? Like, you can't invoke implicit consent when explicit consent is there, because implicit consent is only for when explicit consent can't be acquired. Does that make sense?
I think that you're appealing to a presumption of a set of property norms that not everyone's going to share.
But that's what the point of this peace agreement is for. That's what I'm saying. That's what's missing in our world, is a universal peace agreement where we say this is the law, and no one can accuse us of being tyrants for enforcing it. Even if they don't agree, even if they don't want any part of our peace agreement, the fact of the matter is we can still enforce it because we're only enforcing the black and white. We're only enforcing it when we're acting with that beyond a reasonable doubt certainty. So,
okay,
like I say, I don't see where anyone's objection can come from, you know?
Okay, so what happened is I gave an example of a gray area that wasn't actually gray, and rather than take it as an example that we just deal with and we assume that this is a gray area that people are going to disagree on because it doesn't have an equation behind it, you solved the equation and defeated my argument. That wasn't the point. I agree with you that property abandonment is bullshit, commie nonsense. That's not the point. I was picking like an example of something that we haven't solved yet. So don't solve it and assume it's not solved, and assume you have people that disagree on it, and then take your counter argument. So it is an unknown. It has not been solved. That's where you have to respond from.
Okay, I'm just trying to think of an example.
I know, it was a bad example. I hate the the fucking age of consent one, because it's so controversial. You can't say anything about it
but it's
on
a
either
good one because it is a genuine grey area. That's the reason why it's a good one. I know it's a terrible one, but the reason why, but that's what I say.
It's not a genuine grey area, but I refuse to talk about it.
Okay, all right. Well, how about this then? Vaccinations. Okay, vaccinations on children. Okay, like people. Let's say that, and it doesn't even have to be on any actual vaccinations that exist where we could kind of pick it apart or whatever. Let's hypothetically is a vaccination, and it's a grey area as to whether that's the best thing to do to vaccinate your child or it's not the best thing to do to vaccinate your child. My point is in that scenario, according to my little peace agreement, is it would be quite clear that that's a grey area. It's the parent's decision. Self-ownership would dictate the peace agreement that we've already got, even though it doesn't deal specifically with the grey areas, it still says who does, if you know what I mean, because that concept of individual self-ownership gives the parents a guardianship, which gives them a right beyond others over how that child's welfare is best guarded. And unless they're stepping over a black and white line where they're clearly abusing that and violating that, we don't have a right to interfere with their guardianship. So vaccinations, grey area. The Nations of Sanity approach would be simple. Self-ownership would dictate who has authority over that grey area, and in that situation, it would be the parent. Is that a fair example?
I like it as a grey area example because, you know, it's easier to make the case for one that maybe there's some disease that's so deadly that you could make a case that if you didn't do something medical to your child to protect them from this thing, that you could make a case that it's child abuse. In which case, if it's child abuse, you are justified in using force to rescue the kid or to give them the treatment, irrespective of the parents' consent. So hey, I think we found a good example. Good job for that. That's actually a huge win. So something that isn't age of consent. That's great. So it seems like you are potentially citing your project against the child in this situation. I'm saying that you are taking a stand. Jesus. Taking a stand. That's not what I meant to do. You're taking a stand. You're picking a side in the continuum, a side that you think is the conservative one, but somebody else could argue is actually the extreme one. You're leaving the child completely unprotected. Why did you pick that side instead of the one that protects that's more protective of the less, or the more innocent, less able to protect themselves?
Because if we're agreeing that it's a grey area, if we're saying that, we think that this child is at risk, but we can't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, then we lack that reasonable certainty to come in and violate the parent's guardianship. Okay, sorry.
Sorry to interrupt. No one is agreeing it's a gray area in the situation. Me and you might having a meta discussion, but we're having a conflict in your, analytical, future world. And no one thinks there's a gray area here. You got one person that is trying to use force against the parents to rescue this kid from this terrible situation, and you have these parents that are demanding that they have rights. There's no gray area involved here. There's two people with completely conflicting, mutually exclusive opinions of the property rights in play. Okay, go ahead.
The person who wants to come in and take your child away because they think you're stepping up. So they're saying you're not in a grey area. You're stepping over the black and white, and you're abusing your child by not getting them vaccinated. Okay, the person that's asserting that has got to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt before they can take your child. They can't just do it.
To who? Who do they have to prove it to?
Well, this is the issue. Who? It's the same, but that's the same.
6 years. It took us 6 years. We have found the issue. Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, no, but that I'm not denying that's an issue, but that's kind of an inescapable issue. I mean, that issue exists with even a black and white thing like rape. I've still got to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you raped somebody, and you say, well, who are you proving it to? You know what I mean? It's like, well, I guess I'm proving it to a court system, but another court system could perhaps challenge that. And challenges could go on, on and on and on and on and on and on and on. So yeah, no, I mean, I understand what you're saying, but this is what I'm saying. This is why you have to kind of, I mean, it will get to a point where if you had, and I don't see how this would be any different in any other possible incarnation of a society, is if you've got two NAP enforcements, say, or what do you call them, DOAs, the district court things that you have, conflict resolution things. Even if you have all of these, if they're in a situation where they're both adamant that the line is being crossed, but in like opposite directions, neither is sort of conceding any kind of grey area, then that's conflict, isn't it? Like if there's a bunch of people who think that you didn't commit a rape, and there's a bunch of people who think you did, and they think it's beyond a reasonable doubt that you did, and we think, that it's not beyond a reasonable doubt that you didn't, then there's a potential conflict there because, they're going to want to put you in prison, and we're going to not want to let you go to prison because obviously that's kidnapping and assault and all the rest of it. So I don't have a solution to that. I mean, that's not something I'm pretending to solve with the Nations of Sanity project. I'm saying that the best way.
You did try though. Like the first attempt at responding to the situation, you had your Nations of Sanity project come down on one side of that line. So are you now saying that your project would not? It would leave the situation alone because it's now a gray area? Because everything that's disputed is going to fall into this. Every dispute is going to fall into this problem where you have two people that disagree. And so which side is your peace agreement going to come down on? Who's going to be the judge? Are they elected? Is it democratic? Or is it individual and decentralized and consensual? Which is it?
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Yeah. No, I mean, basically what the Nations of Sanity is coming down and dictated is how we approach it. So it's like in the individual rape case, it's not saying, because the Nations of Sanity is not some god that's going to come down and say, this is the truth of this case. But what they're saying is you have to determine it beyond a reasonable doubt. That's your standard. So, and if your standard fails the beyond a reasonable doubt standard, and then it's a grey area. And this is so like the reason why it came down on the side of the parents in what I thought when I thought it was a grey area case. That's nice and easy. The Nations of Sanity can say, well, the parents decide because it's grey area. But then when you said, oh, well, no, then they're asserting it's not a grey area. They're saying it's black and white. They're saying these people are abusing their children and we have the right to take them from them.
what's the Nations of Sanity going to do there? The Nations of Sanity is saying, well, they've got to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. And when you say, okay, who have they got to prove that to? Who's overriding who? Okay, that's where my answers end. I will, put my hands up and say, okay, well, I don't have the answer to that, because I'm saying it's a little bit like, even if you had like a constitution or a king, or say a constitution said these are the laws, or a king that said these are the laws, or these are the commandments, or whatever. Even if you had it as like that, and this is how you're still going to have people interpreting it, and you're still going to have people got to, establish, do their little investigations and their evidentiary and their court, and say, okay, we're satisfied that the moon's not made out of cheese, and all of this kind of thing. The fact of the matter is no matter what we do, whether we have a dictatorship or a free society, we're going to have to come to some kind of consensus of reality and how we establish objective reality and facts. I can't help us with that. Like, if people are going to be so disingenuous where they'll kind of swear that black is white, or they're going to claim they've got a beyond reasonable doubt when there's enough sizable people that can see they haven't, maybe those people, like I say, I'll hold my hands up and say I can't solve it beyond that point. I'm just saying I think we can solve it to that point where we can say, okay, well, this is the approach we have to take. We can enforce the non-aggression principle as law, and we can enforce it when we know, we're justified doing so when we have that beyond a reasonable doubt certainty that someone is actually violating that law. If it's a grey area, then we've got this self-ownership dictated approach to who has authority over it and what have you. But we cannot escape the fact that there's human interpretations are going to differ. Humans are going to argue over facts, and all of these kind of things. And if it's in a situation where, like with a hypothetical vaccine, like with a hypothetical disease, where enough people are claiming it's that certain, then they're obviously going to enforce it thinking they're justified, and other people are going to enforce it thinking they're justified. Just like I say, if enough people think that 100% certain beyond a reasonable doubt you raped someone, they're going to want to put you in prison. And if we're 100% certain you didn't, we're going to not let them put you to prison, and it's going to be war. And I don't know how that could possibly be avoided, but I certainly don't think any kind of solution would involve, any kind of authority coming down and, siding on one way or another. I just think we've got to have some kind of, it's not a constitution, it's a peace agreement, but even if it was, like the American Constitution is supposed to kind of dictate how everything flows below it from there, that's kind of like what I'm proposing with the Nations of Sanity project, to say, okay, well, we have this peace agreement that defines how law should be defined, how it should be enforced. It lays that down. But yes, humans could still make a mess of it. And but I just think the only thing I think is, by having that beyond a reasonable doubt, it does minimize it, because somebody's got to be able to say they are, beyond like in the case of the vaccination and trying to take your child, it's like they've got to try and present evidence saying, okay, and anybody who's going to say wants to object to it, they've obviously got a right to that evidence, and they can say, well, this isn't evidence. And, I suppose they could argue about it to the end of time. That would be a flaw. Like I say, I don't have a solution to that, but I just think we can get that far. And I don't think there is any other solution beyond that anyway. But I think we could get that far. We've got a sane society with sane rules. It's still going to require diligence from people. It's still going to require us not being lazy and just declaring everything a grey area because we can't be bothered to do the work to work out what the objective truth is to it. But the fact of the matter is we're working from the right foundation, or the right blueprint, that, well, this is how we define law. It's not based on democratic majority or anything else. It's based on this principle, and we can objectively define it based on this principle. And when we come across a grey area, if it is a grey area, it even tells us, who has the benefit of the grey area kind of thing. And if we truly find ourselves in conflict over a black and white, where you're swearing, black is white and I'm swearing white is black, then conflict is not going to be avoided. I suppose that's why I call it the terms of peace, because these are the terms of peace, and if we can't agree on those, then the alternative is the violence, I guess.
Okay, so hopefully, I feel like I've made my point because I felt like you just repeated it back to me that
Hmm.
every conflict situation, even an asshole that knew he was guilty secretly, would still try and make an argument that he wasn't the bad guy and he was justified by some situation. And so then the whole question becomes, what is the justice system? And then we move on to, okay, so your peace agreement, if it forces one type of justice system on everybody, then we're right back to where we started. We're a non-consensual, unlibertarian situation. If we're like if you had a bunch of DROs, dispute resolution organizations or whatever, and I had one and you had one and we came in conflict, you'd probably have like DRO networks that had some kind of foundational boilerplate set of rules that were simple and, you know, not trying to be all inclusive, but they're like, hey, here's the foundation. Property rights, commies, get the helicopter, you know, whatever. So then you'd have networks of DROs that would probably circle the wagons around different baseline operating systems for their justice system. But you're still going to have competing ones, and you're still going to have conflicts between competing ones, and you're still going to have conflict. So I'm lost. I'm kind of back to, okay, so what's different then about the peace agreement, the Nations of Sanity thing, and what I just described?
Potentially nothing. I mean, the devil might be in the details, but I mean, because like I said, I don't have any problem with what you just described. I mean, my only stipulation, if I was kind of, putting my support into it, would be that it was all under this kind of that foundation, or on top of this foundation, or under that umbrella, whichever way you want to kind of word it. But like similar to what I'm kind of proposing with this kind of overarching peace agreement, saying like, I'm happy for all these DROs to operate, but within this larger kind of agreement that is the non-aggression principle. So I suppose the reason why I kind of focus on that a little bit is like to use the example of my debate with David Friedman about the whole, anarcho-capitalism could exist in a non-libertarian way where you've got DROs that have drug laws and slavery and all this sort of shit. It's like, well, okay, well that can't exist. That can't be recognized as legitimate. That has to be deemed as criminal across the board, So it's like you can have it's one thing to have DROs operating their own little kind.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Hold on. Sorry to interrupt. You brought up a discussion and I didn't really get enough context from you on what the hell you were talking about. So I maybe go into that a little more if you want to use it as a point of contention, because I don't know what we're talking about now. You had a conversation with David Friedman about...
Sorry, I forget that everyone's not in my head with all my information.
Yeah, catch me up.
I had a debate with David Friedman a little while ago, who basically conceptualized anarcho-capitalism as not definitionally libertarian. I don't want to strawman his position, but I had a debate with him, so people can check it out if they want to see what he says. But basically, he was arguing that anarcho-capitalism isn't definitionally libertarian, and even though he thinks it more than likely would lean that way naturally, it could exist and still be anarcho-capitalism and have things like drug laws and slavery and all these coercive, NAP-violating things. And my argument in my debate with him was, no, that violates the definition of anarchism and it violates the property rights that underpins the definition of capitalism. And that's my point. Like, these decentralized systems still have to operate within a basic understanding of property rights, self-ownership, a basic understanding of crime, rights, where our freedom ends and where it begins, even if it's a very low resolution, broad stroke understanding. So that's why I'm saying about, like, when you talk about, I'm sorry, I forgot what you called the dispute resolution.
DRO, organization. You can call it whatever you want. Yes. Call it an insurance company or whatever. No, you can call it whatever you want. It doesn't matter.
But that's what I'm saying. I have no problem with those DROs. In fact, that's exactly how I envisage it would likely be in my my dream Nations of Sanity idea that I'm talking about. But it would exist under that overarching thing. And any DRO that tried to enforce drug laws, for example, or anything that clearly stepped outside of these lines in the sand that we would draw, that would define the non-aggression principle in these broad strokes, would be recognized as criminal. Because that's the thing with all of this. We still have to have a basic understanding of property rights, a basic understanding of the concept of individual self-ownership, and that would give us our, what is and isn't a crime. And it doesn't solve the problem of, proving it and, and all the rest of it. And like I say, that's why I think the DRO is probably the best solution for the conflict resolutions, because if you do have, somebody who's wrongfully prosecuted by one DRO and you want to bring other DROs that step in and all the rest of it, they're probably going to avoid a violent resolution by, other means and what have you. It's going to be, there's going to be other reasons why people are going to want to go negotiate that. But the fact of the matter is they're still working from the overall playbook, the overall commandments or whatever, you know what I mean? It's like it's kind of like establishing that parameter for it, so that something like the David Friedman version of anarcho-capitalism doesn't exist. So it is the DRO system that you're talking about, where all of these DROs are just interpreting and enforcing the non-aggression principle in slightly different ways, because people are going to want to do it different ways, and maybe they'll also have rules within the grey areas as well, because they want better definition there and stuff like that. That's all great, but they still need to be within that larger agreement, that larger peace agreement. It's a little bit like how nations on the earth today don't have a world government over them, but they might have peace treaties like no slavery or whatever and stuff like that. It would be a kind of similar kind of concept, I suppose, but obviously not between coercive criminal organizations like governments. Instead, it would be between NAP-compliant organizations like DROs that would be enforcing it in different ways, but all, like I say, working from the same basic rule book, which would be sort of defined by the NAP and the concept of individual self-ownership and the property rights that come from it.
I think you're never going to get people to agree. All of my objections are practical, man. Like, yeah, sure, ideally, the non-aggression principle, as I understand it, as you understand it, as we agree, it's great. Yeah, sure. Make that. So, like, the thing is, like, I don't need a law. We already have the principle. We already have the moral philosophy. I don't need a law to tell me that I can attack somebody that breaks into my house. I don't need that. It's superfluous. And anybody that disagrees with that as a law or as a moral principle, I don't really give a shit. We're already at war with that person because they've already declared themselves my enemy by not respecting property rights. So is this just like a practical thing? You're trying to get people to rally around this principle that 99.5% of the world doesn't understand?
Well, yeah, because to be honest, you alluded to you alluded to my reasoning a little bit there.
Okay.
Because it's like, yeah, you don't need a law, and it's a little bit like you wouldn't have needed a law against slavery back in the days of slavery either. But unfortunately, on a societal level, it wasn't recognized as the crime it is back then. And now you still live in a society where plenty of non-aggression principle violations aren't recognized. So even though you don't need that law, wouldn't it be nice, I suppose what I'm saying is yes, you don't need it, but wouldn't it be nice to live in a society where you know that on a societal level, that same understanding is understood and agreed in a kind of formal, established context,
But it won't
You don't have to live under the...
But it won't be. Like, and I don't mean it won't be like established as law. Like, even if you established it as law, it won't be understood by everyone or by even most people. Like, people already, like, if you ask most people right now if it's wrong to steal, they would say, hell yeah, it's wrong to steal. They would say, do you own yourself? Hell yeah, I own myself. But they obviously disagree with the implications of those things. Like, let me try and sum up.
I'm not sure most of them do. I don't think a lot of them have even had their conversation within their own head. I mean, most people don't even question taxation because it's always been there, and it's just something they accept. But when you actually have a conversation with people about it, some will defend it, but all of a sudden the percentages drop drastically. It's only really because they live in that society. I mean, unfortunately, and I don't want to sound like some kind of, oh, I'm intellectual because I think more than other people, whatever, but a lot of people are sheep and they'll just go along with whatever. If society changes one way, they'll bear along with it. And if society changes another, they'll bear along with it. If we get enough people to create a free society where enough of us create those societal norms and understandings and this peace agreement or whatever, then the sheep will follow along. You know what I mean? And, so, I mean, I'm not saying that it's as easy as that. Obviously, it's not. Otherwise, we'd have done it already. But, that's my kind of my point about it is, I don't expect everybody to understand it, but we need there's the thing is I understand what you're saying, but there's a certain aspect of it where you kind of look back and you think, in a way, this should already be how it should be. You know what I mean? It's like there should be enough smart people in the world, but I don't think they've honestly had the conversation. I mean, the libertarian thing is already a narrow kind of percentage of people that are even kind of think about libertarian, and even libertarian doesn't really represent it properly because that's been kind of diluted and perverted and what have you. Like, like libertarian parties and stuff are often just, they joke that, they're just Republicans who smoke weed or whatever, you know what I mean? And, so it does take a lot of work from people like yourself and Lark and Rose who, champion this to try to kind of break through to people's brainwashing. It's not like, and I don't think the Nations of Sanity is just going to magically do it either. But my point is or what the Nations of Sanity is trying to do is just kind of saying, well, that's the kind of goal we need to be aiming for, because when the only thing I think that's missing, and I don't want to sort of critique, the work of other people, like yourself and Lark and Rose, because I think you do fantastic work and, have a lot of respect for your interpretations of the principle and your consistency with it and all the rest of it, which is why I, like the scrutiny, because I value it and stuff from people like
That's why
yourself.
you subject yourself to me?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Fair enough.
But
you honor me by
is,
wanting my attention. So thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. But the only thing I see sort of missing from it is like, I view someone like Lark and Rose as like in the days of slavery, who would like saying, slavery's wrong and explaining all the reasons why, and it's great and it's perfect and he does a great job of it. But I'm kind of saying here, let's abolish slavery. Let's agree formally to abolish it on a societal level in a formal way. Now, that doesn't make slavery any less or more wrong. I mean, I think that was one of, and again, I don't want to speak for other people, but I think that might be one of his objections to sort of saying, well, look, it's wrong regardless of whether you have your precious peace agreement. I'm not saying that the peace agreement invalidates the non-aggression principle, but it is about creating that societal understanding and that formal establishment and acceptance. This is crime. This is your right. This is your freedom. This is the law that we can justifiably enforce. And, and this is what's not. So that's kind of like my kind of, that might not be the best, people might disagree with that characterization, but that's at least how I see it in my head. I see like, you guys are championing the reasons why slavery is wrong. And the only thing I'm kind of adding on to that is saying, well, I agree with all of that, and you say it better than I do. But I think we should actually have, champion an actual agreement or something where we all get together and say, well, let's abolish it then. Let's all agree that it's illegal. But rather than just doing it with slavery, we do it with all non-aggression principle violations.
Hold on. You're not like trying to create some entity or organization of people that has enforcement powers. You're saying, hey, here's a set of ideas that we should all agree on. I mean, we're already doing that. Like, we all already agree. Maybe that's where my confusion was. Like, I'm out here trying to create more libertarians. A lot of other people are doing the same. We all agree. I agree right now that it's a great set of ideas to come together around. If that's all you're doing, and you're not trying to create any enforcement, and you're not trying to, create any kind of organizational structure to control people or have like say in people's lives, especially not in any of these. When we say gray areas, that's a misnomer, because like I said earlier, everything's going to become a gray area. If we can just say like, we're marching under this banner of self-ownership and non-aggression, my guy, we're doing it. We've been doing it for years. We're going to continue to do it. Like, I'm there. I'm trying to hoist that flag as high as I possibly can. Is that the case, or are you trying to create something more sort of centralized and formal and to affect people that aren't that don't want to be a part of it.
No, I mean, like I say, the only effect that it would have on people that don't want to be a part of it is they still would face the consequences of violating it, the same as people that have, formally agreed. But like you say, that's just, I suppose, like I say, the only thing the thing is, and this is why I think perhaps our conversations have been like this in the past as well, is because our disagreements are quite nuanced. We are on the same page, very generally speaking. If you squint your eyes, what we're saying is kind of the same. And perhaps like the differences you could argue are almost pedantic in a way, but like, I suppose from my point of view, the objections I've heard from yourself have been about like disagreement. And there seems to have been, it's almost like, it feels like, and I don't want to speak for you, but it almost feels like there's a suspicion of this kind of authoritarianism being snipped into this kind of piece.
I can't imagine why there would be. I'm joking.
Look.
Come on. You're calling something laws? You're talking about some kind of agreement? Like these are typically authoritarian words that you're talking about.
I understand that, but maybe subconsciously I'm being intentionally provocative with my language.
Well, I mean, that's why I'm shit testing you on these areas then. Like,
but think about, what am I calling law? What am I saying that we can enforce? I'm calling law what is objectively definable under the concept of individual self-ownership. I'm saying that's what we can justifiably enforce. So it's like, I understand like some of these words can be kind of triggering and misleading, but when you delve into what's behind them, it's just the non-aggression principle. It's like sometimes I even say provocative, if an alien race came down and enforced it all for me, I'll be, yeah, great, thank you. And people are like, well, you're enforcing it. It's like, yeah, but what am I enforcing? The non-aggression principle. So you're free, just do what you want, just don't violate other people, otherwise force will be used against you. And whether it's done on a local level or whether there's some super advanced alien race that are kind of policing it, if that's all that's being policed, where's the complaint?
Here's the complaint. Here's the complaint. Okay, cool. Is because people are going to interpret that exact, very simple, basic NAP completely differently. It's going to happen. So you're not reducing any conflict. Maybe you're reducing some, but you're not. In fact, if you're getting a bunch of people together to give authority to this idea, this peace agreement, which implies some kind of organizational structure, you're giving power to whoever is involved in that over making the decisions about these gray areas. If that's what you're doing, if you are explicitly saying, no, I'm not saying we're going to have a body of anybody get together to say what is and isn't the black and white bare metal interpretations of the non-aggression principle, then yeah, sure. As long as you're acknowledging that there's going to be a bunch of people that are going to interpret it different ways and there's going to be conflict, fine. But if you're trying to, in any way, top down, get a certain group of people together to declare an interpretation of the non-aggression principle, then that's not libertarian. And it's not even going to work.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, no. All I'm saying I'm saying that all I'm trying to do is minimize that by having this like established agreement where we've got some kind of universal formalized understanding of this concept, to try to minimize the fact that people are going to just like have completely different interpretations of the non-aggression principles, get it out there so that there is a better understanding and people can find the objectively true answer, and the gray area shrinks down to where it actually belongs, where it genuinely exists, rather than just where people lazily assign it because they can't be bothered to find that more correct answer. But no, I mean, one of the things I do also do, because I do present ideas on, like, I have like an article on voluntary socialism and ideas about voluntary collectives and stuff like that as like alternatives to coercive governments and stuff like that. But I'm very clear. There's only one thing that I'm saying has to happen. The other things are ideas that can be tossed aside. Maybe they're good, maybe they're not. None of them would be forced on people. The only thing I'm saying that we can force on people is the black and white non-aggression principle when we have beyond a reasonable doubt objective certainty for it. So no, in fact, it's explicit in my project that we can't enforce the grey areas on people. And like I say, it still leaves the debate over where we draw that line, but it's still saying that that's the standard we've got to meet. We've got to meet a beyond a reasonable doubt certainty that someone's violating the non-aggression principle to enforce the law against them. And in those cases, like, so it's basically, it's giving us the principle, but it's not telling us exactly how we go about it. And that's, like I say, that's why I said I don't disagree with you guys on the DROs. I just kind of supplement my little Nations of Sanity agreement and just say, well, can we just have that there as well as like an umbrella over these DROs or a foundation under these DROs, just so that the David Friedmans on this world can't have little slavery camps and drug laws that they're passing off as legitimate businesses because they've got their own interpretation that just ignores the NAP completely. That's kind of my point. It's like, okay, we can have DROs and we can have different ways of doing it, but it's still got to be some kind of sane interpretation of the non-aggression principle and concept. And if it's not, then, like if it's commies with their kind of twisted version of property rights or whatever, then we'll use force against them. And we know we're justified in doing so because but it's beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not a grey area. It's not, or maybe it is their house because their grand left it and they want to make it, into a commune or, it's because so like I say, I want to be clear on what problems I am solving and what problems I'm not, or what problems I'm trying to solve and what problems I admit are unsolvable, And the problem I'm trying to solve is to try to reduce the chances of conflict by saying, well, let's get on the same page. And like I say, with the DRO, like I say, with everything else, I'm on the same page as you guys. And that's why, I love your work so much, because I do think you represent such a consistent, when so many people seem to get the non-aggression principle wrong, you guys get it right. And like I say, 99% of the time I find myself agreeing with you, which is all the more reason why I wanted to explore your scrutiny of my project.
Have you written something? Have you written this agreement so that I can look at it and either agree to it or point out where I don't agree to it?
Yeah, I've got a website, nationsofsanity.com, and one of my many articles does lay out the specific agreement. It's like a 3-part piece agreement. So it basically lays out the 3 parts. So part 1 is the basic agreement, like that basic agreement that the non-aggression principle should define law. Part 2 is the lines in the sand, saying that we need to draw lines in the sand that separate the black and white from the grey, and we can only enforce the black and white. And then part 3 is rightful ownership, saying we need to properly define and establish what property rights are based on the concept of individual self-ownership. These are the 3 dimensions of the agreement that need to be in place for us to have a workable peace agreement that would give us a conceptualization of the non-aggression principle that we can work from.
As long as I am agreeing to hold my own property to these rules and not other people's, then I'm happy to join your nation of sanity. Hold on, I need to have a side moment with a couple people in chat real quick. Guys that have been obnoxiously telling me I'm wrong repeatedly in chat for the past hour, especially bifurcating the conversation into talking about argumentation ethics, which I completely and utterly did, in fact, unfortunately, destroy. For every 10 comments you spend in my chat telling me I'm wrong and not coming on the show to have the discussion, you're embarrassing yourself. Chill out. Come on the show. Have the chat. Tell me I'm wrong. Show me I'm wrong. Don't just keep talking shit in the chat. My God. All right. So, shall we talk about? I think that's what happened. Me and you, we were in the comments of some YouTube video on somebody's channel. I don't even know it was mine, but we were talking about how argumentation ethics wasn't it, and you were saying it was your it, and I was saying no, it's my it. So that's, and then we were like, okay, let's go ahead and do the show. So. Okay, so, do you have more time? I know it's like probably 1:30 in the morning where you are, but if you'd like to...
I'm good.
Okay, so, what are rights?
Oh, this is our other disagreement. Rights are obligations. So if it's a moral right, it's a moral obligation. Rights are entitlements, sorry. So if it's a moral entitlement, then it's a moral entitlement, and if it's a legal right, then it's a legal entitlement. Your definition of rights is reciprocal agreements, I believe. And that was, funny enough, that was why, sorry, I don't want to take your definition, but that was one of the reasons as well why I wanted to kind of, present the Nations of Sanity to you again. Because
your definition of rights, even though I quibbled with you over the definition, because I don't think rights are properly defined as reciprocal agreements, but I do agree that that's the best way for them to function in society, which is why I then kind of lead on to my Nations of Sanity project, because I think, well, we need to establish them as peace agreements. So I do agree with you. I agree that your definition of rights as reciprocal agreements is how they should be treated, but I don't think that's actually what they are. I think what they are as a definition, like if you were to look it up in a dictionary, it should say like entitlements as a synonym, for example.
Entitlements that you declare for yourself?
Well, no, I mean, if it was a moral entitlement, like if you were morally entitled to it, then the entitlement would be declared by morality. If it was a legal entitlement, then whatever legal...
we have to be careful. We have to be careful not to reify. We have to not reify anything, right? So morality is just a concept. And so if you're saying that a concept summons into existence these, I'm sitting on an exercise ball, which is why I'm bouncing, and I think it might be slowly deflating, which is why I think I'm like sinking down the longer we go. Sorry. So I might have to switch to a chair. So you say that these entitlements come from morality. Morality is a concept. Concepts are not held by all people. So you're saying that people that hold to a morality declare for themselves entitlements. I'm trying to restate what you're saying, but in more realistic language, less reified, less abstract language.
Yeah, I mean, to put it this way, if my child was asking me, "Daddy, what are rights?" I'd say they're entitlements. If someone says you've got a right to something, they're saying you're entitled to it. If you have a right to that car, that they're saying you were entitled to it. A bit like ownership, but like I would say entitlement would probably be the closest synonym to it. Like I say, that the reason why I reject reciprocal rights as a definition is just because I don't think that's actually what they are. I think that's the best way for them to function, but or for them to be established. Hence my project. But I don't think that's actually what they are. I don't think they are like I say that you have a right over yourself. That's your moral right. Now, that's regardless of any reciprocal agreement. Now, the reciprocal agreement might be important for your right to be recognized and not violated, but it's not what the right is. Like, it feels like our disagreement on the definition of rights is a little bit pedantic, because I kind of agree with a lot of your arguments for the definition, but I don't think they serve as an argument for the definition. I think they serve as an argument for how they should function in the world, if that makes sense. But I think as an actual definition of what rights are, I think they're just basically that. They're entitlement. That'd be their definition.
All right, I'm going to try and change your mind. My goal is now to convince you otherwise. What you're saying is that rights are just like assertions. They're assertions that you make from yourself to the world about what other people should and shouldn't do in regards to yourself. That's what you mean by entitlement. You're asserting that you're entitled to a certain treatment, positive or negative obligations, just depending on what you're talking about and how you're thinking of it. You're asserting that you're entitled to something. Right? Question mark?
I am, but I don't think assertion is the definition of right. I think the definition of right is entitlement, but I am making that assertion. If that makes sense. I don't think the assertion is tied to the definition, if you know what I'm
Well,
saying.
no. Can you explain that more?
Yeah, like, for example, I could say that a slave has a right to be free, or a slave owner doesn't have the right to own that slave. Now, that is an assertion about a right. So the right itself is not an assertion. I'm making an assertion about a right. If that makes sense. That's how I'm just separating the assertion from what I'm asserting, if you know what I mean. Like I don't think a right is an assertion. I think a right is an entitlement. Now, we can assert that entitlement, we can assert that right, but again, I kind of I mean, maybe I'm kind of wrong here, but the way I define right is just as the assertion. So even though I agree that its best function is a reciprocal right, and even though I am asserting it, what it actually is just, sorry, not an assertion, an entitlement. It would help if I said the right words I actually meant to say to make this. Sorry, I'm saying rights are an entitlement.
Yeah, say it again from scratch so I don't get it twisted.
Okay, yeah, I'll use the right word this time. It will help. So I'm saying that rights are an entitlement. That's all I'm saying rights are. I'm saying I'm asserting that. So, the assertion is connected, but what an actual right isn't an assertion, and it's not a reciprocal agreement. It's just an entitlement. That's how I define what a right is. But I do agree that entitlement or that right can only really function as a reciprocal agreement in society and be established, and and the assertion is obviously tied to that. But what a right actually is like I say, that's how I would define it. Like in a dictionary, under rights, I'd be like entitlement, and then I put like moral right, you are morally entitled, legal right, legal entitled. That's what right means to me. If you say you've got a right to something, that's what you're saying. You're saying you're entitled to it. Not necessarily saying you're asserting, you got to have an assertion of the right. I'm just saying you have a right, whether it's asserted or not. Does that make sense?
Well, first of all, it's circular unless you're really careful, right? So a right is an entitlement, which means you're entitled to something. What's an entitlement? Well, it means you have a right to something.
Right.
Like, okay, hold on. So, but also because you can't detect the existence of an entitlement, because that's just an idea that one holds in their head about how the world should be. They don't have, with that definition, rights are undetectable and obviously immaterial, but sort of like useless. Like, I really do suggest that you think about this sense of entitlement that you have about things around yourself as you just asserting, like, the world needs to treat my house as my property and not trespass. Like, you're entitled to your house. You're entitled to the sanctity of your property. You're asserting that you have property rights over your home, over your property. I think understanding that the reality of what that is and how they are is clarifying and empowering, because you're more in touch with reality. If you walk around with an entitled badge on your chest and you come across somebody that doesn't see that entitlement badge or doesn't give a shit that you're wearing the entitlement badge, the assertion, it is equivalent to it not existing. It is equivalent to you not even thinking about that thing or holding that concept in your head. So why think about it in such agency lacking ways? I think a lot of people do because it's colloquial. It's easy to talk about rights as reified property that exists and can be transferred and stolen. A lot of people talk about, all rights are property rights, and when somebody I don't want to digress too far. So I would just suggest that you're just talking about assertions that you're making to the world, saying that you're entitled to these things. This is not something that exists. There's no entitlement. There is no entitlement that somebody else doesn't create by agreeing with you in any functional way in the world. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's just a concept, and concepts don't really do anything if no one's paying any attention to them or asserting them or reciprocating them, which is, I'm pretty sure I understand what you're saying and where you're coming from. And correct me if you think I'm not understanding you. I'm pretty sure I am, and I actually, this is what I mean. Like, I even though I still assert that it's not a definition of rights, I agree with everything you're saying about the fact that we still need the assertion and we still need the reciprocity. You're 100. I'm not disputing that at all. You're 100% right. I do agree on that. like I say, that's why I feel like my point is potentially somewhat, maybe even unnecessarily pedantic when I say, but that's still not the definition of rights, because what rights are entitlements. Yeah, they're not much good if you don't assert them and if there's no reciprocity. You know, what good is the right that what good is a slave's right to be free if no one's asserting it and no one's reciprocating it? That right might as well not exist. But as a moral truth, it still does. I suppose that's kind of where I'm coming from. So, like I'm saying, that slave is still entitled to their freedom. They still have that right in some very abstract, almost metaphysical way. But yeah, I totally take your point. If it's not being asserted and it's not being reciprocated, it might as well not exist, and it's not much use to anybody, which is why I think that your definition of rights is an excellent argument for how rights should be treated. And so that's why I feel kind of bad kind of picking it apart in a way, because it's like, I have no problem with you kind of going out in the world saying, look, this is how we should treat rights, because I fully agree with you, and I fully agree with the arguments that you lay out for why we should treat them as reciprocal agreements and assertions. But I still just think that definitionally, that's not what they are. What they actually are entitlements. But those entitlements don't do us much good if we don't assert them and if we don't have reciprocity existing with them or exercise them with, you know, as reciprocal agreement.
Okay, let me try one more angle. Do I have the right for you to deliver me tea every morning when I wake up?
Just to clarify this, because this is a little bit like when people say, do I have the right to water? And I say, well, you don't have the right as in I'm not obligated to get water for you, but you do have the right as in I'm not allowed to stop you from drinking it, kind of thing. So just to clarify, when you say your right to tea, are you saying in the sense that I'm obligated to provide you tea? Is that
Yes.
what you mean?
Yep.
No, then you don't have that right. No.
What's the difference between that entitlement badge that I'm wearing, where I walk around the world saying, Matt, it is my right for Matt to deliver me tea every day? What's the difference between that assertion, which you're calling an entitlement, and the one that you have that says somebody can't trespass in my house?
Well, there's no foundation underneath your assertion. Like, where does your right come from? You know, like the rights that come from individual self-ownership obviously have that foundation. But like, because this is the thing about the rights assertion, is like, I can't objectively say that I have a right to anything, because I can't objectively say that morality is a thing. But what I can say is that, say, for example, a rapist doesn't have the right to rape somebody. A trespasser doesn't have the right to trespass on your property. You don't have the right to demand tea from me. The reason why you don't have any of these rights is because you don't have any foundation. Like if I say, well, why do you have that right? You've got nothing to base that on. You say, oh, well, because I have like my right over my car, or my right over my property, and my right over these other things comes from my right over myself. You know, it all stems from that and is consistent from that. But if I tried to claim a right over somebody else, it would violate the very concept that my own right comes from. You know, so it's like, how can I assert a right over anything if I don't have right over myself? And if I have right over myself because self-ownership is a thing, then I obviously can't have right that would violate anybody else's self-ownership.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
So what just happened was I pointed to my badge that I'm wearing that says I am entitled to tea every morning from Matt. And I said, how is my badge different from that badge you're wearing, which says that I can't walk on your property whenever I want? And what you did to respond is you pointed to this other badge you have on the other side of your chest that says you own yourself. And so again, I'll just say, what's the difference between my badge and the one that you're wearing now that says that you own yourself and have what's the difference between those two assertions? They're both assertions. I'm asserting that I'm entitled to something. You're asserting that you're entitled to something. All you did was move from being entitled to me not trespassing to you owning yourself. So what's the difference between these two assertions?
Um, well, well, basically, because sorry, I'm just going to get this right in my head how I'm explaining this. So, because if we start with the presupposition that everybody has right over themselves, then like the trespassing thing comes from that, like as self-evident from that, like as a nice, like just as like if we agree on maths as our presupposition that 2 + 2 = 4, we can work out objectively that 4 + 4 = 8, and all the other calculations, no matter how complicated, might need a calculator, but they're all objectively identifiable. And it's the same thing with rights. If we start from individual self-ownership, all the other rights are like as objectively true as a mathematical truth, as 2 + 2 = 4 and all the rest of it. You cannot do that with your assertion that you're entitled to tea. That doesn't come from anywhere. There's no internal consistency. There's no universality. It's just completely arbitrary. It's I don't really know how better to explain it.
You can't call my assertion completely arbitrary if all it takes to make your self-ownership one that people agree. In fact, you said that it's more valid because we all agree. Like, you're bringing up the idea of agreement, contractual agreement or reciprocal agreements into why your badge is more valid than mine. We all obviously don't agree that I have a right to tea every morning from Matt.
What did I say that we all agreed on? Sorry, what was more valid because we all agreed?
I asked you what the difference was between my badge for tea and your badge for self-ownership, and the first thing you said was basically it's an axiom, it's a presumption, it's something that you're presuming, which is not an argument, by the way. That's just like, this is an arbitrary assertion. You're just asserting that your badge is fancier than mine or more important than mine, which is not an argument. And then you went on to sort of bolster and justify the idea of your self-ownership badge by saying, well, it's important because we all agree. It's like, well, the agreement is the part that we're missing, is the thing. The agreement between us is what makes your badge more important than, or more functionally extant than mine, is an even better way to say it.
Okay. But what I'm saying is, with my self-ownership badge, is like if you have that yes or no flow chart, it's like if at the beginning of that you have a choice between accepting or rejecting the concept of individual self-ownership, if you accept it, then like what I'm saying is if you accept it and we're both wearing that badge, then the next badge is, all the other badges are self-evident from that first badge with regards to self-ownership.
We don't disagree.
If you reject it, then you're rejecting rights altogether. So your assertion that you have a right to anything has no foundation because you've already rejected. Okay, go on, tell me.
No, I'm asserting that I have a right to tea from Matt every day. That's an assertion. That is an entitlement.
But based on what?
And when I asked you, if I had that badge, you said no. And then when I asked you about yours, you said you had the self-ownership badge. And I'm asking you to justify that. And any justification you come up with for your self-ownership badge, I can also use for my tea badge. If I got everybody to agree, then I would have a right to tea from Matt every day. Just like if everyone agrees, you have a badge to self-ownership. And so I'm telling you that the badge is I'm telling you that the badge is the least important thing. It's the agreement that is the right. If people treat you like you're a self-owner because you're a good person and you don't go around hurting people and taking their stuff, the agreements are the rights. Without the agreements, you're just a guy yelling that you should have tea every day. You're just asserting something to the world. You've got nothing. You've got a spook in your head. You've got a notion in your head that no one cares about, and it might as well not exist because that's not what does anything in the world. So if we're going to talk and think about rights, we should talk and think about them in terms of how they actually change anything in the world, change our interactions, modify how people behave. The concept exists through its action, through its inaction, through its reciprocation. Because without that, it's just you sort of yelling it into the wind. You're farting into the wind about how you think people should be behaving. I mean, you can call that a right if you want, but like, who cares?
I understand what you're saying, but that's more about like the practical application. I mean, your assertion that you have a right to tea is incoherent and arbitrary. Like, there's no consistency to it. There's no universalizableness to it. Like if I say, well, why have you got a right to tea? Like, if I say I've got a right to my house, and you say, well, why? I say, well, because I believe. All right, I do take your point about okay, I'm still starting with a presupposition, an assertion that I have right over myself, just like you're asserting that you have a right for tea. But
hold on, stop, please. Sorry to interrupt. You're doing the same thing that we did earlier when I brought up the shitty example of property abandonment. You're attacking the shitty idea I had about obviously a fucking right to tea for Matt every day is a horribly illogical, irrational idea. Please don't attack that, because that's not the point. The point is I'm asserting a behavior out onto the world on how I am entitled to be treated. That is just an assertion if no one else cares. Whatever it is stupid. Please don't attack the specific idea.
Okay, all right, okay, all right, okay. Yeah, no, and I do understand the point or at least I think I understand the point that you're making, that these rights are no good to us without the assertion and without the reciprocity. Like, I don't disagree with that.
They are the same as not existing, is what I'm saying. Like, it is the same thing. They're equally as detectable in the world as not existing. To say that you have an entitlement no one else reciprocates. It is that conception equates them to non-existence. Whereas my conception gives them a detectable thing that you can say, look, he's got a right. Look at all these people that respect Patrick's property and would even come to defend his property if they saw somebody, breaking in the middle of the night. Like, he has rights. Look, you see all these detectable behaviors in the world, sort of around that. That's a much more sort of tangible.
I was with you until that last bit. The problem with that, though, is I see, like, okay, well, what about in the days of slavery, when everybody recognizes the slave owner's right to have slaves and is happy to enforce it and, and agree to it and assert it and all the rest of it? Like, for me, but that, like, then, that's like, they're making a false claim about rights, so there's still a moral truth to that. Like the consensus and the assertion and the reciprocity, as much as that is essential for rights to be any practical good to us, it's not what they are definitionally, because you could have that reciprocity and that agreement and that assertion for, kings rule, governments rule, slavery, all of these things. You could have those things for those things, but those rights would still be invalid. They wouldn't be proper rights. Whereas, so like, even though I say, I'm not disputing what you're saying about like these rights no good without the assertions and the reciprocity, but it's like I suppose the reason why I define rights as entitlement is because if I was to agree with you and say the exact same thing that you said, look, rights are no good without the assertion and the reciprocity. They don't do us any good. I could say I could just replace rights with the word entitlement, and I'm saying the same thing. Entitlements are no good, and because entitlement and rights work as synonyms, as interchangeable synonyms as each other, then for me that means they have the same definition, and that's why I define rights as entitlement. Even though I agree with you that when it comes to practical applications, these rights might as well not exist in any kind of meaningful sense if there's no reciprocity and there's no assertion of them. But the reciprocity and the assertion itself doesn't define them, because you could have reciprocity and assertion that apply to things that aren't rights, like a king's rule, like a slave owner.
That you assert aren't rights. I mean, you're just making an assertion about what can be asserted. You're saying you're making declarations about what somebody else can declare. I want to make sure we're using the word assert the same, because some people in chat seem to think that we're using it differently. I'm not sure that we are. When I'm saying you're making an assertion, I mean you're basically sort of announcing to the world that this is how it should be. And if no one listens to you, no one cares, and no one agrees, then you've just done nothing. You've made a null
Okay,
object.
that's true, but I mean, okay, well, this is how I'm kind of sort of seeing this. So, like, just give you a window into my crazy brain. Like I understand. I feel like I understand what you're saying, but it seems like you're saying, okay, yeah, but you're just asserting that 2 + 2 = 4, and I'm asserting that 2 + 2 = 5. We're just both making assertions. They're both the same here, and I'm saying, well, no, they're not the same, because my assertion is based on this internally consistent and coherent logical progression. And yours
is a presumption. Okay. You declared that at the beginning. You're just presuming. You're taking it as an axiom that self-ownership is a thing. You're not doing the work of building up to self-ownership. You're just asserting it. That is your premise 1. I own myself. You didn't do any work to get to premise 1. You just started there. That's kind of cheating. You can't both just say, "Oh, I'm presuming self-ownership," and say that it's all these other reasons to presume. Like, what are you doing? Like, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You either do the work or not.
Okay, well, the only work I think, and if you think I'm wrong on this, I'd like to know the answer, like where I'm wrong on this, because this is,
I mean, for everybody watching, sorry to interrupt one more time, just for everybody watching, because there's new people that stop by all the time. I agree that he owns himself. Okay, we're not. I'm not arguing against Matt's self-ownership. We agree. We're arguing over how we get there, and what rights are, and how we can assert our rights onto other people and treat other people differently because of our assertions or entitlements. Like, we have to understand where these concepts come from if we're going to interact with other people around them effectively. So this is not me arguing against Matt Sands' rights to self-ownership. All right, go ahead. So sorry to interrupt you yet again. Please go ahead.
No, that's fine. I understand. From my point of view, and please correct me if I'm wrong on this, because I'd be interested to hear what you got to say. But from my point of view, the only work you can do to get you to self-ownership, like saying, "Oh, I'm not doing the work to get, I'm just starting a self-ownership, and it's all rosy from there, but I'm being lazy because I'm starting from there." From my point of view, the only work I can do prior to that to kind of justify starting at self-ownership is to say that for rights to be in the conversation at all, like I can't assert the rights as an objective truth, but what I can say is, if rights is a thing, like I can't say that morality exists. Okay, I can't say that. Like, when people say you can't get an ought from an is, that's true. You can't get an ought from an is, and all we have is. So how do we get to the ought? We have to have a presupposition or a hypothetical imperative. So if I take a hypothetical imperative and say, okay, what about morality? Does morality exist? If it's like a yes or no thing, if you say no, then you can't assert rights. If you say yes, then okay, then rights is something to be kind of, defined and discovered. Okay, so is there such a thing as rights? If you say yes, and you've got your yes or no thingy. If you say no, there's no such thing as rights, then you can't assert a right to tea, because you've already said that no, there's no such thing as rights. If you say yes, there is such a thing as rights, okay, well, and this is why I liken it to the whole maths thing. It's like, well, there is such a thing as maths, and we can maths. If we assert there is such a thing as maths and 1 + 1 + 2, we can discover the whole thing. And that's why I'm saying about, if we say there is such a thing as rights, once we kind of take that journey in our yes-no kind of dichotomy thing, once we're down the road of saying, yes, there is such a thing as rights, then self-ownership becomes the only coherent presupposition for the concept of rights, at least from the way my own brain has worked it out. I can't think of any other way for rights to exist in a way that is coherent, internally consistent, and universalizable, other than starting at the presupposition of individual self-ownership. So from my point of view, it's like, I can't assert that you have a right, but what I can say is that you definitely don't have a right to this, this, and this if it violates the concept of individual self-ownership, because to get there, you have to accept that there is such a thing as rights. To say that you have a right to coffee or tea, you have to say there is such a thing as rights. And if further down the line you've already rejected the concept of rights, you can't demand a right for cups of tea. I think I might have laboured my point, but I hope I'm kind of making
some level of sense.
Oh yeah, I mean,
Tell
have
me if
you
I am or not.
have you read? And this is a stupid thing to bring up in the middle of a discussion. I probably should have sent it to you beforehand. Have you read the Anti-Subjectivist Manifesto, the document we put together? It's like 10 pages long, and it addresses this specific part of the conversation. I just wanted to know if you had read that before, and no shame if you haven't, obviously.
No, I haven't.
Oh, okay, cool. So, what I think most people do, because this is what a lot of people, this is what everybody wants. We all have an innate desire to be protected and to be, to assert our rights, to assert our existence in the world, and to assert our entitlement to not be attacked, stolen from, defrauded, etc. It's very natural to do those things. And so we have this like tendency, we have this innate desire to only accept a view on reality that has protections in it for us. I have rights. You can't hurt me. I have rights. You can't trespass. I have a right to the sanctity of my property. You can't punch me. I own myself. I own this body. I have an entitlement that prevents you, or that says that you shouldn't punch me, because that is my entitlement. That is my assertion. And a world where those concepts exist in some more sort of real place, as more of a reified thing, where we have these things that exist almost as tangibly as like this pen or this oversized coffee cup. Like, I have rights. God damn it. You can't punch me. That's where everybody wants to live. That's not reality. And I think what I've tried to do is go back to what is real. Go back to the bare metal existence that we have. Understand what that actually is. And then figure out what rights actually are in that space of what actually is. Rights as tangible, reified things don't exist. That's just ideas in people's minds. If there's nothing physical about them, an anvil doesn't drop out of the sky when you punch me and hit you on the head. The reality that we live in is that of the state of nature, sort of a Hobbesian, but not really state of nature. It's one of tooth and fang, where might makes right. Might makes right is the closest thing to bare metal reality that there is. And all that means is just a fancy way of saying, if I'm strong enough to take it, if I'm strong enough to do it, then that's what's going to happen. And what's my justification? I was strong enough to make it happen. That is reality. And us fancy schmancy humans with all of our millions of extra neurons floating around thinking, wearing all of our entitlement badges so proudly, it's a delusion. It's something that we have overlaid on top of what actually is in reality to sort of fool ourselves, or to sort of make ourselves feel better and safer than we actually are. And I think there's a lot. Well, first of all, I have a couple points to make, so let me digress for a while. The first important point is that when we understand the bare metal reality of might makes right, that is what is. That is what is. Might makes right. Not rights, not protections from property and consent. Might makes right is what is. There's no shoulds involved there. That's just how it is. And when we understand that and we come to terms with it and realize that's the actual world that we live in, we can better protect ourselves, because we don't have all of these spirited, reified spooks, let's say, floating around us, protecting us from all the people that might punch us or steal us or defraud us. We don't have any of these assumptions on how the world works, or these things called rights that we have that protect us. When you jettison all of that and realize that you actually exist in a world where I won't say might makes right, but that's how reality is. People can take what they want, what they're powerful enough to take. There's no should there. It's just what they can do and what they can't do. That's the state of nature. Now, that's the world as it exists. That's reality. That's how the animals interact. And guess what? We're animals. So let's have the humility and let's be enough in touch with reality to recognize that. Okay. Now, we are lucky to have big ass brains that use up 80% of the oxygen we breathe in when we're not working out. And we have developed the ability to think on higher orders of consciousness, let's say. We can conceptualize, we can universalize, we can particularize. We can analyze all the different moving parts of things, take them apart, put them back together in new ways, try them out in our heads. We can form agreements between each other. We can share the same concept between us, and we can form agreements around those concepts. So we have all these capacities that allow us to choose to behave above the state of nature, is the best way I can describe it. I can choose to not take that which I'm strong enough to take. I can choose to respect your body and to not attack you, even if you have something I want. And you can choose to do the same. You have the capacity for that. I have the capacity for that. And so when you and I choose to think about a concept called consent, which I think is the most fundamental one, even before property and self-ownership, I think consent, and I think property and self-ownership is actually implied from consent. Once we start thinking about these concepts and sharing them between us and choosing to modify our behavior according to these reciprocal agreements, now we have created this new thing. Now we've created this new concept called rights. Now rights exist. Now we behave differently. Our behavior changes. We interact differently. But as long as we remember that we never left reality, we never left the actual real world where the people that don't reciprocate those agreements with us are still out there. They're still lions, and they're still human versions of lions. And we're not protected. We don't have rights shields and rights armor around us. No. We have reciprocal agreements between good people, people that deserve our respect, and people that earn us respecting their property and self-ownership. That's what rights actually are. That's how they actually work and actually can protect us. So we're positively and negatively protected more by my conception of rights than the traditional ones. We're negatively more protected because we don't think we're safer than we are, and we're positively protected by explicitly now being able to go out and find people to more explicitly reciprocate rights with, like your peace agreement. Like, now that you and I know that we have the ability to think about a peace agreement and we can explicitly reciprocate it between ourselves, now I have the ability to not worry about you as a lion in my orbit as much, because I know that you understand the Nations of Sanity concept, and so do I, and we agree. And even no matter how much you have something I want, you can be guaranteed I'm not going to take it from you, even if I have the right to do it. Okay, rant over. That was my attempt to convince you.
That's great. I mean, I'll tell you what. I mean, you still haven't convinced me that that's the definition of rights, and I think I've already made my case for why. Like I say, I just consider rights a synonym for entitlement. And I do think I did already understand a lot of the point you've made with regards to, like that this is how we should treat rights. I will say, though, that I think the importance of that truth has kind of sunk in a little bit deeper from what you've just said. Even though I already kind of thought, yeah, I know that's the point he's making, but kind of as you were saying it there, the kind of importance of that truth did seep in a little bit more. Not just because it sounded like a lovely pitch from my Nations of Sanity project with the whole reciprocal right thing.
You like how I did that at the end?
Because yeah, I did. Yeah, if anything was going to win me over, it was that. But no, I mean, I pretty much agree with all of that, and that's why I kind of say that sometimes I feel like our disagreement on the definition of rights is somewhat unnecessarily pedantic, because your definition of rights is exactly how I want everybody to treat rights, and I agree perfectly with you when you say that is how we should treat rights. Like I say, I just in a very somewhat pedantic way still say, but it's not actually what they are in a kind of, like I say, in my dictionary, under what rights are, I'm saying that they're entitlements and what have you. But in my book on how best to how rights can actually function as actual meaningful things in this world, then I'm going to basically copy and paste what you just said. So I do recognize a lot of the truth in that. And funny enough, like with the might makes right thing, I often say that the only people I can't argue against are people that say might makes right. I can't dispute them when they say that, because they're already rejecting morality. They're already rejecting rights because they're just saying, look, might makes right. There is no morality. It's who's strong enough to assert it wins, and that's how it is. And I can't deny that truth. And that's like where I come from with this. I can't make an ought from an is, you know. Yeah, I can't make an ought from an is. So, you know, but what I say is, okay, well, that's fine. But the might makes right people can't assert that they have a right to copy from me, or a right to own slaves, or a right to anything, because they've already said might makes right. So if I was to establish the might to enforce my non-aggression principle, they would have no complaints. Now, the people that don't want to just accept might makes right and want to enter the conceptualization of morality into their, you know, and basically say, oh, no, actually, I think there is. I suppose, because that's what I say, is I can't say for you to assert that you have a right over yourself as an objective truth. The might makes right guy beats me on that. But what I can say is if you have a right, if there is such a thing as rights, like, you know, the only way they can exist as a coherent concept is from the concept of individual self-ownership. That's the only way they can exist as a coherent and internally consistent concept. So,
I know what you mean. I disagree, but my disagreement would be pedantic with the coherent. You could certainly come up with other reciprocated agreements that might not be perfectly universalizable, but that's not worth spending time on. I understand what you're trying to say.
Okay. And I mean, I would I'm not sure it matters an awful lot which comes first, the chicken or the egg here. I think consent comes from self-ownership and property rights rather than the other way around, but I'm not sure that's a meaningful disagreement, because it's like, it's a bit of a chicken and the egg kind of thing. But from my point of view, is if you own yourself, then consent is implied from that, because you own yourself. So obviously I need to get your consent. If you owned your car, I'd need your consent to drive it, you know, kind of like from that point of view. But I suppose you could say consent implies self-ownership. You could say it the other way around. I suppose I just consent. In my head, I start from self-ownership, and then everything is implied from that. So the fact, you know, consent comes from self-ownership, property rights come from self-ownership, the non-aggression principle comes from self-ownership.
To get really nerdy, just to answer your question, the reason why I say consent precedes self-ownership is because consent is generally accepted to be your agreement for something to happen. And you could, in a bare metal Hobbesian state of nature, someone could elicit your consent for something that had nothing to do with your property. And in fact, to even begin talking about things happening to you, you first have to, like, if I have to get permission for something to happen to you, the permission sort of comes first, because I can get your permission for things that have nothing to do, that predate property.
I suppose,
but I can't have it the other way around.
Matters.
But I can't have it the other way around. I can't have property doesn't exist without consent. But consent can exist without property. That's the only nerdy reason I say consent precedes property. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, I got what you're saying. Yeah, but I suppose the way I look at it is why does consent matter if you don't own yourself? Like for me, like the self-ownership is why consent even matters. Like, if you don't have self-ownership, then your consent is irrelevant anyway.
I suppose
that's where I'm from.
I could still choose to respect your consent, your agreement for something to happen that was not related to your property. Like, you can still have consent and opinions about things that aren't yours. It's just a question of how much they matter, you know, but the concept still exists.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I mean, it's one of those ones where I don't feel like it's a big deal. It is a little bit chicken and eggy kind of thing, because I mean, I've had people say to me that I always say that property rights comes from self-ownership, and people say, oh no, self-ownership comes from property rights. I mean, you could argue that it's the one and the same thing, but again, I always, just the way I personally conceptualize it, I mean, the fact of the matter is we're all linking these things together intrinsically anyway, so I don't think it matters too much. But I suppose just the way I conceptualize it in my own head is self-ownership is the starting point, and then consent comes from that, property rights comes from that, the non-aggression principle as an implicit principle comes from that. So I always start with that concept, and then everything else is self-evident from it. But you could, like property rights, you could say property rights and self-ownership comes from that because it's just a property right. Or you could say, self-ownership, as you've said, is from consent. So I don't think it really matters because they're all intrinsically linked as part of the same overall concept anyway. But yeah, that's just how I kind of work it in my own head. Like I start with self-ownership.
Yeah, we have to get into like ontology and theory of minds to dive deeper on that, and we can if you want, but I'm also good leaving it here for now.
That's probably another conversation's worth of topic.
It's like 2 a.m. there for you now. I mean, it's probably a good time to wrap up. Why don't I let you have sort of the last word, and then so I'll say my piece, and I'll let you have the last word. Guys, thanks for watching, even the people that disagree rudely in the comments for 2 hours. I appreciate you guys giving me the benefit of your time and attention. I'm always happy if you think I'm wrong. Come on the show. Have the discussion with me. I want to know if I'm wrong. I enjoy it. Yeah, that's my piece. Thanks for watching. Matt, go ahead and have the last word.
I really enjoyed the conversation. Appreciate it, Patrick, as always. Always a pleasure, never a chore. And for anyone else listening, I hope I've kind of explained myself and my project as well as I could. Like I say, I think all of us, most of us, are kind of on roughly the same page, and I think these conversations are good because I think we all get a little bit closer to a kind of consensus on the truth, or as close to we can get to it, and break through the subjectivity and kind of get a kind of coherent understanding of a concept that I think, at least theoretically, could unite us, or enough of us, to create a free society, maybe one day. It's a dream I still hold on to, and I think if it's going to happen, it's going to happen through these kind of efforts and through something like, what I'm proposing with the Nations of Sanity project. Not necessarily that, but something in that kind of flavor, where I think we need to kind of have some kind of societal understanding and implementation of rights as they would coherently exist in accordance with self-ownership. So really enjoyed it. Thank you, Patrick.
Yeah, I feel sort of at peace with where we're leaving this discussion. Like, I don't feel like we need a part 5 unless there's just some other conversation that I'm always happy to have conversations, especially if you disagree. But finally, part 4, I think we did it. So thanks for coming back on, Matt. All right, everybody. Have a good evening. I almost said the Anarchast. What's the Disenthrall one? Oh, yeah. Okay. Here we go. You've been disenthralled. I'm supposed to say that. I'm obligated to say that.